How well do you really know Tennessee? Because across 42,000 square miles and more than 2 centuries of statehood, there's always another story waiting to be discovered. The growing Tennessee History Nerd catalog takes you from the Scopes monkey trial and the Battle of Athens to the Night Riders of Reelfoot Lake, the Sultana disaster, the failed state of Franklin, the Iron Men of Sewanee, and much more. And in the Driving Across Tennessee series, we travel county by county to uncover the people, places, communities, and stories that help shape the volunteer state. You'll also find full-length conversations with historians, authors, museum professionals, local experts, and the people working to preserve Tennessee's past. And new episodes and interviews are added every week. Follow the Tennessee History Nerd from your favorite podcast app, explore the catalog, and discover another Tennessee story you never knew you needed to hear. Now, let's get into the story. Welcome to the Tennessee History Nerd. This is a podcast dedicated to Tennessee's past. Every week we bring you a new story about the people, places, and events that have shaped Tennessee and made it and us who and what we are. So grab your favorite beverage, find a comfortable place, and sit back and enjoy. The baby had crawled under the house. The house Dan Call and his family lived in was on field rock just high enough to keep it off the ground, where the floor beams and joists wouldn't rot from the damp Tennessee sod beneath it, but it wasn't high enough for a normal-sized adult to crawl underneath. However, it was perfect for a hiding place for a baby to crawl into, and the baby wasn't coming out on its own, and no one else could wedge themselves into that narrow gap beneath the house except young Jasper. Jasper, better known as Jack, was a slight young man, possibly in his early teens, but also possibly quite a bit younger, who worked on the Call farm. Even as a grown man, Jack would never get any taller than a couple of inches over 5 feet, and at this point, he was small enough to crawl under the house and rescue the baby, which he did, much to the relief of the Call family. Jack had been hired to do odd jobs on the Call farm, doing pretty much whatever Dan needed, except help nearest with the still on the creek on the other side of the hill from the Call farm. Jack had wanted to learn how to make whiskey and had been repeatedly rebuffed by Dan, perhaps due to Jack's age. But rescuing the baby had made the difference. After that, Dan decided that he would reward Jack and allow him to work with Nearest and himself and learn the art of making Tennessee whiskey using what would in time come to be known as the Lincoln County process. The man who would arguably eventually become the title contender for the most famous whiskey maker in the world, Jack Daniel, was able to get his start because he was small enough to rescue his employer's baby from under the house. If that story sounds like legend or myth, well, it's because it probably is. In fact, pretty much with any whiskey maker, Jack Daniel included, there's a sizable degree of legend and myth surrounding their origins, how they learned their craft, how they came to be successful, and so on. But the important thing to remember is that with most legends, there is at least a kernel of truth, and sometimes a lot more than that single kernel. But when a lot of the facts weren't seen as important enough to be written down when they actually happened, and then later on different people are telling the stories from memory, well, they sometimes conflict. They sometimes rhyme, but don't match exactly. And such is the case with the story of Jack Daniel. Even Jack's very beginning is hazy. His tombstone says he was born in 1850, and that may be true, but if his mother died, as is sometimes reported, in 1847, then his being born in 1850 would be a rather surprising turn of events. Ironically, even the official website for Jack Daniel's distillery makes light of the uncertainty surrounding Jack Daniel's date of birth. Because it's a site for a distillery, and because its products can be purchased through its website, it requires that you be of legal drinking age to enter it. But where you're required to enter your birth date, the site says, Jack's birth date has always been a mystery. Hopefully, yours isn't. And Jack was evidently something of what we might today call a free range kid. His father, Callaway Daniel, remarried after the death of Jack's mother. Unfortunately for Jack, he and his stepmother didn't really get along. And so he stayed gone as much as he could, which is how he happened to be at Felix Wagner's house the day that Dan Call came looking for help. And Jack was ready to go to work, even at a relatively young age. Some of the stories I've seen suggest he was about 13. Others suggest he was even younger, maybe as young as 7 when he started working for Dan Call. As we said before, much of this is the mythos that surrounds the story of the company founder. And so it's mostly oral tradition. And what that tradition is depends to some degree upon whom you ask. But while the age he started working for Dan Call is uncertain, what isn't disputed is that he was evidently quite young, especially by the standards of today. Furthermore, he was young when he started selling Dan's whiskey. According to Behind the Bottle by Richard Thomas, Jack was probably in his mid to late 20s when he became Dan Call's partner in the Call and Daniel Distillery. This was evidently after Callaway Daniel died and Jack eventually received his inheritance. Dan largely sold his liquor through his general store, but Jack wanted to expand the distribution to enjoy a far greater reach than the single outlet the Call store provided, and he began going on the road. Evidently, Jack was a natural salesman and a born marketer. He first worked his way around Lincoln County. In those days, Lynchburg was still part of Lincoln County, and then he began to cultivate more distant markets, Tullahoma, Shelbyville, Winchester, and even into Alabama as far away as Huntsville. Over the course of the late 1870s and into the mid 1880s, things changed. Ultimately, in a way that changed the face of the whiskey business in Tennessee forever. According to longtime Jack Daniel guide Brian Rutledge, it was about this time that an itinerant preacher was a guest speaker for the Lutherans of the area. Unlike Dan Call, the lay preacher for the Lutherans, this preacher was evidently much more favorably inclined toward the temperance movement and spoke forcefully on the evils of alcohol, drinking it, making it, and selling it. Those who congregated with the Calls, including Mrs. Call herself, ultimately gave Dan an ultimatum: stop preaching or stop making whiskey. He chose to get out of the whiskey business, so Jack was given the opportunity to buy Dan's share. The catch was that when he bought the business, he didn't get to keep access to the site where the still operated. And thus, he moved to Cave Spring, what was to become famous as the source of the pure, iron-free limestone water that was so vital to the Jack Daniel's distillery in the decades to come. That move seems to have been about 1884, but some of the timing of parts of this story are contradictory, depending on the source. However, not only did Jack ultimately have to move the operation, but when he bought the business, Nathan Nearest Green didn't go with him. But Nearest's son, George, did end up working at the new Jack Daniel's distillery, beginning a long history of members of the Green family who have worked there. The next decade, the 1890s, saw another innovation that profoundly changed the whiskey business. Glass bottles began to be able to be mass-produced. Previously, glass was blown and handmade, and not especially practical for the large-scale production of whiskey. But with the advent of mass-produced glass bottles, Jack had a decision to make for his selection of what bottle would be used for his whiskey, and he was shown different shapes and styles. According to an oft-repeated but possibly apocryphal story, Jack is said to have selected the last one he was shown, which was square, and is reported to have remarked, "A square bottle for a square shooter." But just as importantly, the square bottles packed and shipped more effectively and efficiently than round ones as well. So the story is great, but again, it's very possibly some of the mythos surrounding the growth of the company. As the centuries changed from the 19th to the 20th, Jack Daniel's whiskey was still a local or regional name. It wasn't well known outside of the Mid South region in which the distillery was located, but that was about to start changing. In 1904, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition was held in St. Louis from the end of April through the beginning of December. It's better known as the St. Louis World's Fair, and it was a huge event, attracting somewhere around 19 to 20 million visitors and featuring exhibits from 50 foreign countries and 43 of the then 45 states. Only New Hampshire and Delaware didn't officially participate. Jack Daniel decided to enter his whiskey in the fair's international spirits competition. The legend has it that he had to be convinced to enter because he didn't believe he'd be able to successfully compete against established whiskey makers from places like Kentucky. But not only did he compete well, he received a gold medal. The distillery thereafter advertised that recognition as the fair's endorsement as Jack Daniel's whiskey as world's best whiskey. To be fair, though, there were multiple gold medals awarded, so the award is not without qualification. But neither does it make the achievement meaningless. Jack's operation was quite small relative to the major Kentucky bourbon producers and some of the northeastern distillers. So winning one of the fair's highest awards gave a relatively obscure regional distiller a powerful, internationally credible marketing claim. And Jack, being Jack, understood exactly what to do with it. The medal became part of the product's identity and advertising. It validated both his whiskey and the salesmanship that had carried it beyond Lynchburg. It marks the point at which Jack's years of cultivating markets, distinguishing his product, and building a recognizable brand finally received approval and recognition on a world stage. And to this day, it's part of the marketing story of the brand. Another story that's tied to the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair is how the flagship product came to be known as Old Number 7. One of the stories is that for the purposes of judging, Jack shipped 7 barrels of his whiskey to St. Louis in advance of the exposition to provide a product for their judging, planning to follow them to the gateway city at a later date. At some point, those original barrels were misplaced, and the committee notified Jack of this problem. Jack agreed to send another 7 barrels. After the second set had been shipped to St. Louis, but before they could be received, the committee is said to have notified him that the original set had been located, and Jack told them to use the original set, the Old 7, for the purpose of judging, which in turn gave the whiskey its name. But that story isn't the only possible source of the name of the whiskey. Jack Daniel never married, but he was known to have a fondness for the ladies. He was something of a dandy and strove to dress well, to dress as a sophisticated Southern gentleman. He also is known to have had a number of lady friends, girlfriends, if you will. And as the story goes, his favorite was his 7th girlfriend. Although, as has been stated by multiple commenters, if his nickname for his favorite girlfriend was Old Number 7, it's probably very small wonder that he never married. Jack began to experience some health issues later in life and to slow down, and he began to turn more and more of the day-to-day operations over to 2 of his nephews. Lem Motlow, the son of one of his sisters, was evidently handling more and more of the financial aspects of the business, and his brother's son, Dick Daniel, was handling most of the day-to-day distillery production operations. It was to these 2 family members that he would ultimately transfer the business. That transfer was actually due to happen independent of Daniel's death. As his health had been declining, on April 16, 1907, he deeded the distillery and about 200 acres to Lem Motlow and Dick Daniel, with the transfer to take effect on January 1st, 1908. Lem would later buy Dick's portion out. And according to Brian Rutledge, Jack continued to be involved in making, tasting, and selling the whiskey, but the responsibility for operating the business had increasingly been passed along to Lem Motlow. But then came the situation with the safe. According to tradition, Jack arrived at his office one morning and was unable to remember the combination to his safe. Frustrated, he kicked the safe, which injured, one account says broke, one of his toes. The injury became infected, then gangrenous, and continued to worsen. He evidently experienced a miserable decline that lasted several months, including undergoing multiple operations. He even ultimately lost his leg, but he never recovered. He died on October 9th, 1911. A number of theories abound as to why Jack's wound was never able to heal. Of course, the practice of medicine was much different then, and many chronic conditions weren't understood at all in 1911. And Jack's status and love for the good life meant that his diet was likely not especially healthy. Some theories suggest that his wounds didn't heal because he was probably diabetic, although to be clear, this is a modern theory. And like so many other things, the safe kicking incident and its after effects are the traditional story of how Jack Daniels' colorful life came to an end. And some of this dates back even to before he actually died. Nevertheless, some historians question whether Jack ever actually kicked the safe at all, or whether the infection was caused another way and the safe story was later created to provide a colorful and memorable story. As is said in the movie The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, when the legend's bigger than the truth, print the legend. Jack is buried in a plot high on a hill overlooking Lynchburg, Tennessee. Several of his family, including nephew Dick Daniel, are also buried there next to him. But most interesting is that there are two white wrought iron chairs that sit at his grave in front of his tombstone. According to Brian Rutledge, this is said to be so that his lady friends can come and visit him and sit a spell with him. The ladies' man, even in death. With the death of the founder and namesake of the distillery began the next era in the distillery story, the Lem Motlow era. And if Jack Daniel faced challenges in getting the distillery known outside the local region, Lem would face challenges just surviving. The same influences that had led Dan Call to exit the business had grown significantly in the United States over the latter part of the 19th century and early 20th century. Groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union were gaining popularity and influence and were inspiring colorful individuals like Carrie Nation, who was known for what she called hatchetations, which described her invading saloons and single-handedly destroying them with a hatchet while singing hymns and praying. More importantly, these groups were gaining influence in promoting prohibition from a political standpoint. Tradition holds that this is why Dick Daniel chose to sell his share in the distillery to his cousin Lem Motlow. He saw prohibition on the horizon and believed that it would ultimately destroy the business. And he was almost right. It very nearly did. It may come as a surprise to many to discover that Jack Daniel's whiskey hasn't always been made in Lynchburg. Certainly it was during the lifetime of Mr. Jack himself, but shortly after Lem Motlow took over the operation, the state of Tennessee went dry. This happened in stages. At first, it was illegal to sell or consume alcohol within 4 miles of a school. Later, in 1909, the Tennessee legislature made it illegal to produce alcoholic beverages anywhere in the state. Birmingham went dry locally, briefly reversed its course in 1911, and then Alabama adopted statewide prohibition in 1915. Lem ultimately established a Jack Daniel's distillery at 3960 Duncan Avenue in St. Louis, where the whiskey was made for several years using the familiar charcoal mellowing process. He even brought members of the Green family to work there, and some of that Missouri-made whiskey was reportedly shipped back to Tennessee. The Lynchburg operation was shuttered during this time. Then, in 1920, following the passage of the 18th Amendment, the United States began its decade-long experiment into prohibition. No alcohol could be produced legally anywhere in the country, with the notable exception of a select group that were licensed by the federal government to produce medicinal alcohol. At that time, a number of medicines were alcohol based, so that handful of licensed distillers were able to continue operations, but only for the limited application and demand of medicinal alcohol. Jack Daniels wasn't chosen as one of those distillers, and that presented Lem Motlow with a problem. When the national prohibition started, he had almost 1,000 barrels of Jack Daniels whiskey stored under federal supervision at the location of his former distillery in St. Louis, which is quite a lot of product, and capital tied up in that product, and he had very few options to legally dispose of it that would not cause him a huge loss. Folks, if you're looking for a great Tennessee getaway, let me tell you about Birdsong Resort, Marina, and Campground. Located on beautiful Kentucky Lake on the scenic Tennessee River, Birdsong is just 9 miles off Interstate 40 at exit 133, making it an easy drive halfway between Memphis and Nashville. The Keast family has proudly owned and operated Birdsong since 1961, and today the second generation of Keasts continues that tradition of excellent hospitality. Birdsong offers cabins, full-service RV sites, primitive tent camping, boat rentals, boat sales, fuel, bait, and a large concrete boat ramp for easy access to Kentucky Lake. While you're there, don't miss the Tennessee River Freshwater Pearl Museum, where you'll discover Tennessee's official state gem, the freshwater pearl, and learn how the freshwater pearl industry brought worldwide attention to this part of Tennessee. To start planning your getaway, visit birdsong.com or call 731-584-7880. That's birdsong.com or call 731-584-7880. Birdsong Resort, Marina, and Campground. I think you'll be glad you went. And when you call them, tell them Big John sent you. In 1923, he sold that whiskey and its accompanying paperwork. Unfortunately, the company he sold it to was a dummy corporation that was associated with a bootlegger named George Remus and several of his St. Louis partners. The whiskey remained in the federally supervised warehouse. Remus had given instructions to members of the conspiracy on how to be able to siphon a fraction of each of the barrels and replace that purloined liquor with water and neutral alcohol, this being done while a corrupt and presumably bribed inspector looked the other way. The fraction Remus had suggested had meant that gaugers subsequently testing the barrels would be unlikely to discern the difference. The problem was that those conspirators who were siphoning the liquor off got greedy and took a far greater amount than Remus had instructed. So when a gauger later tasted one of the tainted barrels, the adulteration was obvious, and federal authorities charged 31 people, including Lem Motlow. And this is why he was in St. Louis on March 17, 1924. He was there to appear in court with the bootlegging case. What happened next may taint the legacy of Lem Motlow in the minds of some. To first provide a bit of context, Lem apparently didn't regard himself as an ordinary criminal. Probably he didn't even consider himself a criminal, period, but rather saw himself as a legitimate whiskey businessman whose property had been rendered commercially useless by a law he'd opposed. He'd sold his whiskey through documents that gave the transaction an outwardly lawful appearance, and I don't know that there's any real indication that he actually knew otherwise before being charged. The government alleged that he participated in or knew about the conspiracy, but he may have felt that he was actually innocent of any wrongdoing, or else he may have expected his money, lawyers, political connections, and social standing to protect him. And so even though Lem had spent the day in court over a Prohibition-era whiskey conspiracy, he afterward went to dinner and had drinks with friends. Now, that wasn't in itself necessarily illegal. Prohibition prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of liquor rather than consumption itself, and privately held pre-prohibition stocks could still be consumed. So we're not told where the alcohol came from, and it may have been the private stock of some of Motlow's friends that they consumed. But in the thoroughly soaked and frequently corrupt world of Prohibition-era St. Louis, it could have just as easily been illicit. Behind the Bottle describes him as tired and at least somewhat intoxicated when he boarded a Louisville Nashville train bound for Tennessee after dinner. While Lem was making his way toward his sleeping compartment, a black porter named Ed Wallace stopped him and asked him to see his ticket. Lem took offense and the two began arguing. Their confrontation brought the train's white conductor, Clarence Pullis, to the scene. According to the account Thomas takes from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, a scuffle followed before the train had even departed St. Louis. Lem was carrying a pistol. He shot Pullis, who died from the wound 2 days later. Lem was arrested and charged with murder. At Lem's December 1924 trial, the two principal accounts differed substantially. Lem testified that Wallace had attacked him and that Pullis then grabbed him from behind. According to Lem, the pistol discharged accidentally during the struggle and struck Pullis. Wallace gave a very different account. He testified that when Pullis arrived, Lem used a racial epithet while demanding to know where Pullis had found Wallace. Lem then shoved Wallace backward, drew his pistol, and began firing. Thus, Lem described an accidental discharge during an attack upon him. Wallace described Lem deliberately drawing and firing the weapon after a racially charged confrontation. From what I can tell, the only two surviving witnesses to the event who could testify to exactly what happened were Wallace and Motlow. Their respective accounts can't both be accurate, which means that ultimately it was up to the jury to decide whom they believed. Lem possessed considerable wealth and political influence and retained a prominent team of St. Louis attorneys. Tennessee Governor Austin Peay traveled to St. Louis and testified as a character witness for him. But according to Behind the Bottle, Lem's attorneys repeatedly used racial slurs, mocked Wallace's speech, and questioned whether he belonged to a civil rights organization. Ultimately, the jury acquitted Lem. The foreman explained the verdict simply. The jurors did not believe Wallace. Richard Thomas, the author of Behind the Bottle, concluded that the verdict was not proof that Lem was innocent. In fact, he explicitly concludes that Lem, quote, got away with murder, and suggests it's because Motlow was a powerful and wealthy white man operating within the Southern Jim Crow system. Perhaps he knows more than I do, but I can't truly say that I know whose testimony is true. What I do know from what he said is that Motlow's attorney engaged in character assassination of Wallace in order to present his testimony as unreliable, something that many defense attorneys would also do today. Their job is to secure their client's acquittal. Motlow's attorneys did so using tactics that would have made sense at that time through racially charged tactics, but we, of course, find that morally reprehensible today. My take on this is that I really don't know that Motlow was guilty, even though Thomas seems sure that he was. Frankly, I could make a case for the stories of both sides to be rather implausible. I do think that the tactics used by his attorneys in the context of those times today make it feel today as though he was guilty. Those tactics today seem worse than underhanded. This, however, didn't seem to affect Motlow's reputation or standing in the federal bootlegging case. Before the other defendants went to trial in Indiana, Motlow was successful in having his case separated from theirs. His trial didn't occur until 1926, and he was able to get the venue for that trial moved to Middle Tennessee, and the trials were ultimately dismissed against him in that case as well. Behind the Bottle presents this as proof of Motlow's wealth and influence and seems to dismiss the legitimate possibility that Motlow may actually have been innocent in both cases, or he may not have been. But the fact remains that he was ultimately acquitted. It's up to everyone to examine what evidence is available and decide individually whether they believe in his innocence or not. Otherwise, Motlow survived the period of Prohibition through what we would today call diversification. He also owned a hardware store on the square in Lynchburg, and he had a substantial business in the mule trade. Automobiles were only just coming on the scene, and mules were still very much in use for farming and transportation in the 1920s. But even while Lem survived Prohibition through his other business interests, he never completely relinquished his hold on the whiskey business or on the name of Jack Daniel. In the late 1920s, He sold the remaining inventory from St. Louis to Schenley Industries in New York, one of the companies authorized to sell medicinal whiskey during Prohibition. Schenley wanted to bottle that whiskey using the old Number 7 name, but Lem had carefully maintained his ownership of the trademark and demanded to be paid for its use. Instead, Schenley found a way around the problem and sold the whiskey under the name Jack Daniel Old Number 8. The Motlows never forgot this affront. But then another disaster struck. In 1927, a flower fire destroyed much of the original Jack Daniel's distillery at Cave Spring Hollow. So by the end of that decade, the whiskey was no longer being made, the remaining inventory had been sold, and much of the original distillery had burned. About all that remained was the name, and Lem Motlow made sure that he still owned that. By the early 1930s, it was becoming clear to all but the most devoted of temperance advocates that the national experiment with Prohibition was failing. Rather than eliminating the demand for alcohol, it had instead transferred much of the business to bootleggers and organized crime. With the Great Depression adding to the country's problems, Franklin Roosevelt and the Democratic Party swept into power in 1932, and national prohibition was repealed through the 21st Amendment the following year. But repealing national prohibition did not automatically repeal the prohibition laws enacted by the individual states, and Tennessee remained dry. So Lem Motlow did something his Uncle Jack had never been inclined to do. He entered politics himself. Lem was elected to the Tennessee House of Representatives and served there from 1933 until 1937. From inside the state government, he helped secure the repeal of Tennessee's prohibition against the manufacture of liquor in 1937. But even then, the victory was incomplete. The new law permitted liquor to be manufactured in Tennessee, but not generally sold within the state. Furthermore, a distillery could operate only if the county where it was located also voted to allow production. When Lem asked the Moore County Court, as the county legislative body was then known, to call the necessary referendum, the court refused. But Motlow fought back, and he took the dispute all the way to the Tennessee Supreme Court, which ordered the county to hold the vote. Lem then faced fierce opposition from local newspapers, churches, and the remaining supporters of Prohibition, but he nevertheless managed to win the referendum by a narrow majority. Lem Motlow had been forced to win in the legislature, in the courts, and finally at the ballot box merely to regain the right to make Jack Daniel's whiskey in Lynchburg. Jack Daniel had been single-minded in his marketing and promotion of the brand. His nephew was even more single-minded in his determination to preserve it. Some Tennessee stories really need to be seen as well as heard. For only 99 cents a month, you can come along with me through exclusive on-site videos and bonus content from across the volunteer state with a subscription to the Tennessee History Nerd Facebook page. Step inside the Ray County courtroom where the Scopes monkey trial unfolded. Walk the streets of Athens and see the places where the veterans returning from World War II fought to take back their town. And join me at historic sites, museums, courthouses, battlefields, and communities as I search for the stories that help shape Tennessee. Your subscription also helps to support the travel, research, and field work that make the Tennessee History Nerd possible. Visit the Tennessee History Nerd on Facebook, tap the subscribe button, and come explore Tennessee history with me. And now, let's get back to the story. By that time, there wasn't much of a distillery left to reopen. Lem had to rebuild it, almost from scratch. He called back as many of the old distillery workers as he could find, constructed a new brick distillery at Cave Spring Hollow, and finally filled the first barrel of the revived operation on November 11th, 1938. But making whiskey and having whiskey available to sell are two very different things. Whiskey needs time in the barrel to mature, and that meant that Lem had invested heavily in rebuilding the distillery without having an immediate source of revenue from it. He needed something he could sell, but he had preserved the Jack Daniel name for too long to put it on immature whiskey and risk damaging the reputation his uncle had created. So in 1939, the company introduced Lem Motlow's Sour Mash whiskey, a younger and less expensive product that could be sold while the better whiskey continued aging. The company began returning Old Number 7 to the market near the end of 1939, and over the next few years, it developed into a 3-year-old green labeled version of the familiar brand. Meanwhile, Lem began bringing the next generation into the operation. His oldest son, Rager, became executive vice president and then president. His other sons, Connor, Robert, and Dan Evans, assumed responsibility for other parts of the company, while Lem's brother Jess served as the master distiller. Collectively, the younger Motlows became known as the Shirt Sleeve Brothers, educated businessmen who wore shirts and ties, but were still willing to roll up those sleeves and work in the distillery. In 1941, Rager also petitioned the United States Treasury to recognize Tennessee whiskey as something distinct from bourbon. The Treasury agreed that the product was neither bourbon nor rye, but stopped short of creating the clear legal distinction Rager wanted. Nevertheless, he used the ruling to promote the charcoal mellowing of the Lincoln County process as the characteristic that made Tennessee whiskey distinctive. That same year, Lem suffered a stroke that left much of his right side paralyzed. Although he remained in charge, he increasingly relied upon his sons and his brother Jess to operate the company. And then, just as Jack Daniels was finally returning from more than a generation of prohibition, the United States entered the Second World War. The war didn't close the Jack Daniels distillery as Prohibition had done, but it did stop the distillery from making Jack Daniels whiskey. The War Production Board directed distilleries across the country to convert their operations to the production of industrial alcohol for the war effort. This alcohol was used in antifreeze, medicines, pesticides, smokeless gunpowder, torpedo fuel, and numerous other military necessities. The companies were paid for what they produced, but participation wasn't optional, and they weren't permitted to continue making beverage whiskey. Beginning in 1942, the federal government prohibited the production of beverage whiskey. Grain, oak, fuel, and other materials needed to make and age whiskey were also rationed. So the workers at Cave Spring Hollow remained on the job and the equipment remained in operation. But instead of making Old Number 7, they were producing industrial alcohol for the United States war effort, and Jack Daniels made no whiskey from 1942 until 1947. The company continued selling the whiskey it already had in storage. It stopped selling the younger Lem Motlow's Sour Mash so that the remaining inventory could be preserved for the 3-year-old Old Number 7. But barrels can't continue supplying bottles forever. In December 1945, only a few months after the war ended, the last of the available whiskey was gone. And unlike automobile manufacturers whose cars were ready for sale as soon as they came off the retooled assembly lines, whiskey wasn't ready as soon as it came out of the still. So for the first time since Lem had rebuilt the distillery, the company had absolutely no whiskey left to sell. Jack Daniels had survived national prohibition, Tennessee prohibition, the destruction of its original distillery, and the conversion of its rebuilt operation to wartime production. But once again, it would have to begin making its way back from nothing. It was Lem Motlow who had made certain that Jack Daniels survived long enough to begin that return, but he wouldn't live to see what the company would eventually become. The federal government lifted its prohibition against making beverage whiskey in 1946, but the grain needed to make it remained scarce for a time after that ban was lifted, and Lem refused to restart production without corn that met the company's standards. As a result, the distillery didn't begin making whiskey again until 1947. That was That was Lem Motlow's last major decision concerning Jack Daniels. He'd suffered a stroke in 1941 that left much of his right side paralyzed, and during the war he had increasingly depended upon his sons and his brother Jess to operate the business. Then on September 1st, 1947, Lem died of a cerebral hemorrhage. Whatever else might be said about Lem Motlow, and as we've already seen, there's no doubt quite a bit can be said, Jack Daniels Tennessee whiskey almost certainly wouldn't exist today without him. He preserved the name through Prohibition, fought to restore legal distilling in Tennessee, forced Moore County to hold the referendum necessary to reopen the distillery, rebuilt it after the fire, and then guided the company through the Second World War. Regardless of Mr. Jack's role in creating the brand, he'd never faced the kind of challenges Lem dealt with in keeping the brand alive and productive. When he died, ownership passed to his four sons, Rager, Connor, Robert, and Dan Evans Motlow, the men collectively known as the Shirtsleeve Brothers. They inherited a company with an increasingly valuable name, but almost no whiskey available to sell. Restarting the stills didn't solve that problem immediately. Whiskey requires years in the barrel before it's ready for market, and Jack Daniels had exhausted its remaining inventory in December 1945. Although the company could once again make whiskey in 1947, it couldn't immediately replace the mature whiskey that had been sold during the war. They did revive the Lem Motlow Sour Mash brand that had been their father's solution to the same problem after Prohibition. In fact, that brand would continue through 1990. And yet demand was growing. A 1951 article in Fortune magazine brought national attention to what was still a relatively small Tennessee distillery. Then in July 1953, the company introduced the black-labeled version of Old No. 7 that became familiar all around the world. But that attention created a problem. Jack Daniels simply couldn't produce mature whiskey as quickly as people wanted to buy it. The Lincoln County process added time and expense to production, and the company refused to accelerate maturation or sacrifice the quality of the whiskey merely to place more bottles on store shelves. So instead of trying to hide the shortage, Jack Daniels made it part of their advertising. The company's advertisements emphasized the small-town character of Lynchburg, the traditional methods used at Cave Spring Hollow, and the time required to make the whiskey properly. The message was essentially that Jack Daniels was scarce because it couldn't be hurried, and that the company would rather ask customers to wait than to risk disappointing them with an inferior product. Asking for patience was better than asking for forgiveness. That was an effective explanation of a genuine production problem, but it was also extremely effective marketing. Scarcity made the whiskey seem even more desirable. Bottles became difficult to find. Distributors were placed on allocation, and the shortage itself reinforced the idea that Jack Daniels was something special. Ironically, the strategy worked so well that competitors began imitating not only the square bottle and black label, but even the claim that their own whiskey was in short supply. And then Jack Daniels received the kind of advertising that money couldn't easily buy. According to one version of the story, Jackie Gleason introduced Frank Sinatra to Jack Daniels. Another credits Lauren Bacall with introducing Old Blue Eyes to the whiskey. Whichever account is correct, Sinatra became devoted to Old No. 7 during the 1950s, and he didn't keep that devotion private. How many stories can one small barrier island possibly hold? Enough for an entire podcast, and we're just getting started. This is Big John Summers, and when I'm not traveling across Tennessee, I'm down south exploring Dauphin Island, Mobile Bay, and the Alabama Gulf Coast for our sister podcast, Dauphin Island Diaries. You'll hear stories about Fort Gaines, the island's ancient shell mounds, Sand Island Lighthouse, Alabama's artificial reefs, the Dauphin Island Sea Lab, and much more. You'll also hear full-length conversations with island personalities and subject matter experts who help bring these Gulf Coast stories to life. It's the same boots on the ground storytelling you enjoy on the Tennessee History Nerd taken to Mobile Bay and the Gulf Coast. Just search for Dauphin Island Diaries and follow it in your favorite podcast app. And now, let's get back to the Tennessee story. According to distillery guide Brian Rutledge, Sinatra stood on stage at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas in 1955, raised a glass of Jack Daniels, and called it the nectar of the gods. And Jack Daniels hadn't paid him to say it. There was no endorsement contract and no carefully negotiated advertising arrangement. Sinatra simply liked the whiskey and repeatedly said so in public. But the company certainly recognized the value of the relationship. Jack Daniels instructed its first salesman, Angelo Lucchesi, to make sure Old Blue Eyes remained supplied with Old Number 7. At a time when bottles were difficult for ordinary customers to find, Frank Sinatra was one of the few people in the country who could always depend upon having Jack Daniels available. Sinatra was then one of the most famous entertainers in the world. He drank Jack Daniels on stage, mentioned it before concert audiences, and helped associate the whiskey with the glamour of Las Vegas, Hollywood, and the emerging Rat Pack. Former master distiller Jeff Arnett went so far as to say, Frank Sinatra took Jack Daniels from a local small brand to being a household name. But that created still more demand, and Jack Daniels still couldn't make enough whiskey to satisfy it. The problem wasn't merely the physical capacity of the distillery. Expanding a whiskey company requires enormous amounts of capital. A distiller has to purchase grain, barrels, equipment, and warehouse space, and then pay to make whiskey that won't produce revenue for several years as it ages in barrel houses. Federal taxes made the situation even more difficult. Until 1958, whiskey could remain in bond for only 8 years before the taxes became due. According to Richard Thomas and Behind the Bottle, the Motlows had millions of dollars and most of the company's available capital tied up in barrels aging in the warehouses. The family had created a remarkably successful company, but its very success had pushed it beyond what they could comfortably finance. To expand enough to meet demand, the Motlows would have to borrow heavily, bring in outside investors, or sell the company. And then there was also the question of succession. None of the four Motlow brothers had a son prepared to become the next generation of family leadership in Lynchburg. Their sister Mary did have a son, but according to company historian Nelson Eddy, passing a distillery through the female line simply wasn't something the family appears to have seriously considered in the culture of the 1950s South. Mary's family was also living in Florida, and it isn't clear that they had any interest in taking over the company. By 1956, even the youngest of the four brothers, Dan Evans, was already 50 years old. So the family began looking for a buyer. But they weren't just looking for whoever could offer the most money. Jack Daniels was the baby of their great uncle, as well as the inheritance their father had spent most of his life preserving, and they wanted a buyer who would preserve it in turn. Louis Rosenstiel of Shinley Industries reportedly offered more than Brown-Forman, but this was the same company that had bought the old Jack Daniels inventory during Prohibition and sold it as Jack Daniel Old Number 8 after Lem refused to surrender the Old Number 7 trademark without compensation. Rosenstiel also had a reputation for buying, selling, and manipulating whiskey brands with little regard for their history or identity. The Motlows still hadn't forgotten the Old Number 8 debacle, and they weren't about to hand off the brand that was their family's legacy to someone who wouldn't honor that. So the Motlows chose Brown-Forman instead. Brown-Forman was then a medium-sized Louisville whiskey company best known for Old Forester and Early Times. More importantly to the Motlows, it was still controlled by the Brown family rather than operated as a distant corporation from New York or Montreal. According to Brian Rutledge, Brown-Forman also agreed that Jack Daniels would remain in Lynchburg, that it would not move production somewhere else or turn Old Number 7 into merely another label placed on whiskey made at another distillery. In 1956, the Motlow family sold Jack Daniels to Brown-Forman. But the family didn't immediately disappear from the company. Rager Motlow remained president until 1963 and joined Brown-Forman's board of directors. Dan Evans Motlow later served as president and chairman. The transition placed the financial resources of a larger whiskey company behind Jack Daniels while maintaining both the Lynchburg distillery and substantial continuity in its leadership. Lem Motlow had spent decades preserving Jack Daniels from forces that might have destroyed it. His sons ultimately preserved it by recognizing that the business had grown beyond what the family alone could support, and by choosing a buyer they believed would protect the name rather than merely exploit it. The Motlows no longer owned Jack Daniels, but the whiskey was still being made in Lynchburg, and for the first time in its history, it had the resources behind it to become something far larger than Jack Daniel or even Lem Motlow could ever have imagined. Brown-Forman supplied the money, but even money couldn't make mature whiskey appear overnight. The company completed its integration of Jack Daniels by about 1960 and then began an enormous expansion of the Lynchburg operation. Much of the existing distillery was either demolished and replaced or gutted and rebuilt. Stillhouse number 1 expanded from 2-column stills to 5, and much of what visitors see at the distillery today dates from this period. But Brown-Forman wasn't trying to change the whiskey, it was trying to make more of the same whiskey. Consequently, the company almost slavishly reproduced the process that was already being used at Cave Spring Hollow, the same grain recipe, cave spring water, sour mash fermentation, distillation process, sugar maple charcoal mellowing, and new charred oak barrels remained essential. The equipment was expanded and multiplied, but the process itself was duplicated as closely as possible so that the whiskey coming from the larger operation would remain identical to what Jack Daniels had produced before the expansion. And the distillery didn't stop working while the rebuilding took place. Frank Bobo and the distillery crew continued making whiskey as construction proceeded around them, sometimes working from temporary wooden catwalks erected over and around equipment that remained in operation. Brown-Forman was increasing capacity without changing the product. The objective wasn't to create a more efficient corporate approximation of Jack Daniels. It was to make considerably more Jack Daniels while ensuring that the whiskey in the bottle continued to taste like Jack Daniels because it continued to be Jack Daniels. And yet the company still had to wait. New equipment could make more whiskey immediately, but that whiskey still had to spend years aging in barrels before it could be bottled and sold. Although much of the expansion occurred during the 1960s, Jack Daniels remained on allocation throughout most of the 1970s. It wasn't until 1980 that the company finally caught up with demand. Ironically, the reason Jack Daniels finally caught up was partly because the rest of the American whiskey industry was collapsing. Sales of North American whiskey peaked around 1970 and then fell sharply through the remainder of the decade. The generation coming of age during the 1960s and 70s often rejected the drinks associated with their parents. Wine and vodka became fashionable, while bourbon and other American whiskeys increasingly acquired the image of an old man's drink or a cheap drink for working class bars. The result became known as the Great Whiskey Bust. Distilleries closed, brands disappeared, warehouses filled with whiskey that producers couldn't sell. Kentucky companies attempted to lure customers back with lighter whiskeys and other new products, but none of it reversed the larger decline. Jack Daniels should have suffered along with them, but it didn't. Instead, sales of Jack Daniels nearly tripled between 1973 and 1986. Part of the difference was that Jack Daniels had never allowed itself to become merely another interchangeable American whiskey. The company continued emphasizing Lynchburg, Cave Spring Hollow, the square bottle, the black label, and the Lincoln County process. Its advertising presented Jack Daniels as an authentic product made in an authentic place by people who still cared about making it properly. But the brand also had something else, an identity that had grown far beyond its advertising. Frank Sinatra had helped associate Jack Daniels with a particular kind of independent, unapologetic cool. In the decades that followed, that association moved from the lounges of Las Vegas into rock and roll. Jim Morrison, Jimmy Page, Mick Jagger, Tom Petty, and Keith Richards were all associated with the whiskey. The members of Van Halen were regularly photographed with it. And Lemmy Kilmister of Motorhead became so closely identified with Jack Daniels that a glass of Old Number 7 and Coke was often simply known as a Lemmy. None of those men projected the image of someone drinking his father's whiskey merely because it was what respectable adults were expected to drink. Jack Daniels had instead become the whiskey of performers, rebels, mavericks, and people who cultivated the image that they did things their own way. And yet the whiskey associated with rock stars and rebels was still being made in a tiny Tennessee town whose residents weren't even generally permitted to buy it there because even though Lem Motlow had been able to get it passed to produce Jack Daniels in Lynchburg, Moore County nevertheless remained dry. That contradiction became one of the brand's greatest strengths. Jack Daniels could represent both rural tradition and cultural rebellion. It belonged equally to the white-clappered buildings of Lynchburg and the stages of Las Vegas, London, and Los Angeles. Meanwhile, Brown-Forman took Jack Daniels around the world. The expansion of the distillery during the 1960s had created the production capacity necessary to supply foreign markets once the whiskey matured. While much of the Kentucky bourbon industry remained dependent upon declining American sales, Jack Daniels maintained a strong domestic market while expanding internationally. Old Number 7 became not merely a successful Tennessee whiskey, but one of the most recognizable American products in the world. The company also eventually began expanding beyond the handful of labels that had defined Jack Daniels for most of the 20th century. Gentleman Jack appeared in 1988, followed by Jack Daniels Single Barrel in 1997. Later came Tennessee Honey, Tennessee Fire, rye whiskeys, bonded expressions, limited releases, and numerous other variations. But throughout that expansion, the black-labeled Old Number 7 remained the center of the brand. The charcoal mellowing, the cave spring water, the basic grain recipe, and the connection to Lynchburg remained essential to its identity. By the early 21st century, Jack Daniels was sold in well over 100 countries. During Jeff Arnett's years as master distiller, from 2008 until 2020, the number reportedly grew from about 120 countries to approximately 170. And for decades, Jack Daniels occupied the throne as the best-selling whiskey in the United States. It also became one of the best-selling whiskeys of any kind in the world, competing not merely against American bourbon, but against the largest Scotch, Canadian, and Irish brands on the planet. Jim Beam finally displaced Jack Daniels from its longtime position as America's best-selling whiskey beginning in 2022. But losing the number one position didn't make Jack Daniels small. Brown-Forman continues selling its brands in more than 170 countries, and Jack Daniels remains the cornerstone of that worldwide business. The little distillery Jack Daniel established at Cave Spring Hollow had become a global industrial operation. The whiskey that Dan Call once sold through his general store and that young Jasper Daniel carried into neighboring towns had become one of the most recognizable spirits brands on earth. It survived the uncertainty surrounding its founder's beginnings. It survived Jack's death. It survived Tennessee Prohibition, national Prohibition, fire, war, grain shortages, depleted warehouses, succession problems, and the collapse of the wider American whiskey market. And for decades, Jack Daniels stood as the undisputed king of American whiskey. And now, even without the crown, it still remains a giant. I want to be clear that I'm really not promoting a brand with this episode, even though it may seem like it. I really don't drink liquor, and even in my younger days when I did, I only rarely had Jack Daniels. To me, what's truly fascinating is the role that Mr. Jack and his liquor have had on the history and culture, not only of southern Middle Tennessee, but on the popular culture of the United States. and on other nations as well, obviously. Being sold in 170 countries around the world means that little operation that Dan Call and Nearest Green ran from the Call farm and that young Jasper, Mr. Jack, took to Cave Spring, well, it's certainly earned having its legendary story told. And that story certainly is the stuff of legend. And that's going to do it for this week's episode 24, From Jack to King. Next week, we go on the road across Tennessee again, and this time we resume with our trip as we drive across Bradley County. I hope you'll join us for that. But until then, I'm John Summers, the Tennessee History Nerd, and I am history. Before we bring this story to its conclusion, I need to acknowledge the sources that made it possible, and also to say something about the difficulty of separating the documented history of Jack Daniels from the legends that have grown around it. My principal source for this episode was Richard Thomas's Jack Daniels Behind the Bottle, The Masters, the Whiskey, and the Legend of the American Icon. Thomas's book was especially valuable for the history of Lem Motlow, the survival and revival of the distillery through Prohibition, the transition to Brown-Forman, and the extraordinary growth of Jack Daniels during the second half of the 20th century. I also consulted portions of Peter Crass's Blood and Whiskey, The Life and Times of Jack Daniel. Unfortunately, I didn't have access to the entire book while preparing this episode, but the portions available to me provided important background on Jack Daniel himself, the development of the brand, and the criminal trials involving Lem Motlow. Another major source was my own interview with Brian Rutledge, a longtime guide at Jack Daniel's Distillery and a lifelong resident of the Lincoln County area. Brian helped me to understand not only the production of Tennessee whiskey, but also the oral traditions surrounding Jack Daniel, Dan Call, Nearest Green, and the Motlow family. His perspective was particularly valuable because many of these stories have been passed down locally through generations and were never fully recorded when the events themselves occurred. And my thanks to Brian also for guiding me around some of the principal spots in the Jack Daniel story. The Dan Call farm, Mr. Jack's gravesite, Lem Motlow's house next to the visitor center, and his old hardware store on the square, as well as Miss Mary Bobo's boarding house. All those were stops on that tour of notable places in Lynchburg. I also used the Jack Daniel Distillery's official history, including its account titled How Jack Daniel Came to Make Whiskey, and the Tennessee Encyclopedia's entry on the Jack Daniel Distillery, written by Lynn Tolley and published by the Tennessee Historical Society. As we've seen throughout this episode, those sources don't always agree. They differ about Jack's birth, his age when he began working for Dan Call, when particular events occurred, and even some of the best-known stories associated with the company. The baby beneath the house, the square bottle, the safe, and many other parts of the story survive somewhere between documented history and oral tradition. That doesn't mean necessarily that those stories are false. It means that in many cases, the available evidence can't be established as to exactly what happened. Where the sources conflict, or where a memorable story rests more on tradition than surviving documentation, I've tried to make that uncertainty clear rather than present legend as proven fact. I also want to thank Bogart's Cigar Shop on the square in Fayetteville, Tennessee, for providing the venue for Brian and me to talk together. They were very gracious to let us into the building before the shop opened for business and to allow us to use one of their rooms for privacy while Brian and I talked. That interview will be available in the August 18 Interviews Day release. I'm very thankful to all such resources without which it wouldn't be possible to provide these stories to you. And thank you for listening and for continuing to support the podcast. Tennessee history isn't found only in museums, courthouses, and archives. Sometimes it's preserved in a family story, an old photograph, or a memory that only you can share. If today's episode raised a question, brought back a memory, or reminded you of another Tennessee story that deserves to be told, I'd love to hear from you. Use the Send Fan Mail link in the episode description. Email me at john.summers@summersmediaenterprises.com or join the conversation on the Tennessee History Nerd Facebook page. And if you enjoyed this episode, help someone else discover it. Before you close your podcast app, share it with one person who loves Tennessee or wants to understand its history a little better. Your voice can help preserve Tennessee stories and introduce them to a new generation of listeners.